Faith in God is the value that most shaped America.
I think we need the Christian voice in politics today.
We will fail as a nation, and I believe God honors leaders in high places who honor Him.
At 74, he's stepping forward with revelations that could reshape how millions see faith, politics, and power in America. The seconds keep ticking for a religious leader who inherited the pulpit of the most famous evangelist in modern history. At this stage of life, Franklin Graham now speaks with the urgency of someone who feels time slipping away. He describes his nation as spiritually diseased, ethically bankrupt, and careening toward collapse. He insists that malevolent forces have been unleashed upon the streets of this country. What he is now declaring carries the weight of 70 years lived under a name that demanded everything and forgave nothing. The message he says he has held back may represent the final warning before the reckoning he has predicted finally materializes. The stage at the nation's doorstep in May of 2026, he stood before thousands gathered to mark a nation's anniversary and spoke with devastating clarity. The message was simple. America had rotted from within, poisoned by abandoning its moral foundation. He pointed to the acceptance of gender-affirming policies, legal same-sex unions, and the erosion of gender separation in public spaces as surface symptoms of a deeper sickness. He contrasted the broken nation before him with the vision the founders had established 250 years prior. The comparison carried edge. The nation was celebrating its birthday. He was delivering its obituary. Months before, in the opening weeks of 2026, he had issued a national call for repentance. He set a specific hour, noon Eastern Time, a Wednesday for citizens to pause and face their failings. He cataloged the symptoms: unchecked violence in cities, racial hatred spreading, overdose epidemics consuming families, waves of despair sweeping through neighborhoods. All of it, he wrote, pointed to one source: a nation that had turned its back on God. He encouraged millions to stand still at that appointed moment, acknowledge their spiritual bankruptcy, petition for mercy, and reconnect with the divine. The silence of the church is killing the nation. The tone was unmistakable. A man existed who genuinely believed the window was closing, and closing fast. For decades he has repeated the same conviction: if this country refuses to repent, judgment will arrive. Age has not dimmed that certainty. He still wakes each morning, convinced the next political upheaval or cultural fracture could trigger the divine response he has long predicted. At 74, he carries something that most of us cannot touch: a daily awareness that an entire civilization dances on the edge of ruin, and that perhaps his voice is among the last shouting warnings from the crowd. Consider the weight of that. Most people wake burdened by debts, fraying relationships, or personal inadequacy. He wakes believing an empire stands on the precipice of divine judgment. That psychological load works differently when you inherited a last name that preached to stadiums of thousands, when you carry Billy Graham's legacy in your DNA. The silence he now breaks suggests he no longer believes quiet is acceptable. Silence, to him, equals complicity. This intensity showed itself again in April, when the sitting president shared an artificial intelligence image that observers interpreted as depicting him in Christ-like form. Backlash came from everywhere. Franklin emerged to defend, saying the chief executive would never consciously present himself as the Son of God. He called the controversy overblown, a tempest built from nothing. Yet even some conservative voices pushed back hard. They asked, shouldn't a spiritual guide be steering leaders toward humility rather than offering political cover? The exchange revealed how thoroughly the Graham name has fused with the partisan struggles consuming the nation today. The gulf between pulpit authority and culture war combatant had shrunk to nothing. What he reveals now is not a shocking personal confession. It is the full architecture of a life trajectory, one that moved from youthful rebellion to ironclad conviction, and that arc remains inscribed in every statement he makes. When political struggle became spiritual battle, these recent pronouncements did not emerge without history. They grew from decades of treating electoral contests as cosmic battles between light and shadow. During the 2016 presidential cycle, he framed the moment as a confrontation between good and evil. He launched a grassroots initiative that carried him to every state capital, mobilizing Christians to re-engage politically. He believed the republic could only be saved through faith-driven civic participation. After the first President Trump took office, Franklin's support became unwavering. He began describing critics in language that bordered on demonic, and he advanced the argument that God routinely works through imperfect instruments to fulfill larger designs. Under that theological framework, the presidency transformed from a standard political office into a divinely sanctioned rescue operation for a nation he saw sinking into secularism and godlessness. Years earlier, similar patterns had surfaced. He had publicly praised Vladimir Putin's stance toward what the Russian leader called homosexual agenda infiltration. In the middle of the 2010s, he asserted that Russia maintained higher standards than America when protecting youth. During a Moscow visit, he thanked the dictator personally. Those statements came as international observers documented violent assault and public degradation under that nation's legal framework. Power without wisdom becomes tyranny. The praise created fractures within religious communities. The same institution delivering emergency aid in plague zones was also the platform for endorsing brutality elsewhere. I wonder what it felt like for those caught in that contradiction, individuals who witnessed compassionate service emanating from the same source that publicly applauded their oppression. That cognitive dissonance never resolved. The theological rigidity also shaped his public declarations on Islam. Weeks after a major national catastrophe, he appeared on broadcast television and described Islam using explicitly violent language, calling it fundamentally wicked. He repeated similar accusations the following year. Muslim advocates and interfaith councils condemned the rhetoric as reckless during a moment when the nation remained fractured and scared. Yet years later, he refused to moderate. He rejected the concept that followers of Christ and followers of Muhammad serve the same God. He treated other faith traditions as spiritually counterfeit. The pattern stayed constant. He presented himself as a messenger of scriptural truth. His detractors heard escalating religious and cultural warfare. The political and theological intensity never diminished. It only discovered new oxygen in each election season and each social upheaval. The man directing everything kept reiterating that remaining silent would constitute a greater betrayal. The wealth questions nobody wants to ask while his public declarations grew more combative, a separate category of scrutiny remained unresolved. Financial records revealed that combined compensation from his two major organizations reached extraordinary figures in multiple accounting periods. Some public analysis placed annual income near $880,000. Other investigations documented single years exceeding $1.2 million. Recent filings for Samaritan's Purse alone showed compensation approaching $945,000 in 2024, with 10-year aggregate compensation totaling roughly $8 million from that organization exclusively. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association operates under tax-exempt church status, so its compensation arrangements remain substantially hidden from public scrutiny. Charity monitoring organizations and some internal Christian voices raised uncomfortable questions. Does a man preaching renunciation and self-sacrifice deserve compensation that places him among the highest-paid nonprofit executives? The disparity troubled many observers. In 2025, both his organizations withdrew from membership in the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, an institution his father had actually co-founded after the council proposed new governance standards for executive compensation. He called the move an overreach, a descent into moral totalitarianism. The ministries promised they would independently maintain the strictest accountability measures, yet the withdrawal itself raised questions about transparency and who gets to determine ethical boundaries. The concentration of authority compounded the concern. One individual held complete leadership over a colossal international relief operation and a major evangelistic infrastructure. commanding staff decisions, controlling all messaging, and directing enormous flows of donated capital. Admirers pointed to decades of stability and the sheer magnitude of humanitarian accomplishment. Skeptics wondered whether the boundary between missionary calling and executive power had dissolved. Those questions never disappeared. They form an inescapable counterweight to the photographs of mobile field clinics and shipping containers full of gift boxes. The identical organization that positioned doctors in West African hotspots during pandemic response was also the microphone for some of his most divisive cultural positions. The friction between those dual identities rests at the core of his current narrative arc. When conviction became exclusion, the public record on Franklin Graham's statements eventually extended beyond sanctuaries and rallies, reaching into intensely personal spaces and rupturing community bonds. Civil rights organizations contended that his messaging cast the LGBTQ population as a corrupting influence on Christian family structures and traditional morality. His supporters maintained he was simply defending scriptural teaching. In 2022, several scheduled United Kingdom appearances faced cancellation in cities including Liverpool and Sheffield after host venues cited his historical positions on sexual orientation and religious pluralism. He defended his message, arguing that opposing same-sex relationships, transgender identity, and abortion procedures constituted essential elements of his evangelistic mandate. His defenders heard principle. His critics experienced erasure. The words we speak create the world the vulnerable inherit. Many individuals who once connected to evangelical churches reported feelings of permanent rejection and spiritual abandonment after his declarations. Within evangelical leadership itself, even those who honored Billy Graham's earlier ministry began questioning Franklin's rhetorical approach. They described his style as blunt and thoughtless, particularly when addressing racial justice, law enforcement conduct, and sexual diversity. In 2015, after he encouraged police forces to reclaim urban territories by any means and implied that violence would subside if marginalized populations simply complied with authorities, fellow evangelical leaders issued public disapproval. For them, the language had deepened societal fragmentation precisely when healing language was required. I wonder what lives within a person who spends years dispatching teams to build schools and dig wells for the thirsty in distant nations while simultaneously pronouncing spiritual judgment on their neighbors. The identical voice that invokes divine compassion also establishes firm boundaries that leave certain individuals feeling eternally outside the circle of grace. That internal rupture constitutes part of what he claims to be unveiling now, and it resists any simple explanation. The rise of an unlikely heir before the electoral wars and wealth controversies arrived, there was a younger man who took control of a fragile and underfunded charity and expanded it into a planetary force. In 1979, at just 27 years old, Franklin inherited the presidency of Samaritan's Purse after the original founder passed away. The operation was modest. Under his stewardship, it metastasized into a sprawling global enterprise touching more than 100 nations. Emergency response teams materialized following natural disasters, epidemics, and armed conflicts. Medical facilities appeared in West African epidemic zones during the Ebola catastrophe, in New York and European cities throughout the COVID emergency, and in Ukraine and Middle Eastern war regions. One initiative particularly caught public consciousness. Operation Christmas Child commenced in the early 1990s as a simple concept. Regular citizens would pack cardboard containers with toys, toiletries, and Christian literature. Those packages journeyed to destitute children across the globe. By 2016, nearly 11.5 million kids in 104 countries received boxes in a 12-month span. The organization claimed that more than 1.5 million of those recipients made faith commitments. By 2023, the cumulative tally had reached beyond 200 million gift-filled packages. The enterprise merged practical assistance with evangelical messaging in one uncomplicated gesture, creating both genuine impact and enduring debate about whether relief work should include proselytizing. Simultaneously, Franklin commenced organizing his own revival gatherings, termed festivals rather than using his father's terminology. An 8-day series in Australia in 1996 attracted 114,000 attendees. The response rate throughout that event exceeded his father's previous results in that same nation, and 80% of those responding were younger than 25. In 1995 in Toronto, an elderly Billy Graham invited his son to preach during an active crusade. The gesture signified a generational handoff. By 2000, Franklin had become Chief Operating Officer of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. In 2001, he claimed both the presidency and executive leadership of that entity, while simultaneously directing Samaritan's Purse. Two enormous Christian platforms now existed under one successor. The dual authority granted him communicative reach that few other spiritual leaders commanded. It also amplified the consequence of every statement he issued. His words moved far beyond a single congregation or region. They reverberated across nations. The night everything altered, none of the subsequent prominence would have materialized except for a solitary evening inside a Jerusalem hotel room in 1974. Franklin was 22. Prior to that moment, he had been suspended from university for violating dormitory protocols involving a female classmate. He had transferred between institutions repeatedly and earned only a 2-year degree. He consumed alcohol habitually, he uttered profanities freely, and he openly cherished the nomadic lifestyle and alcoholic numbness more than academic pursuit. His skepticism was not the issue. He possessed complete familiarity with stadium-scale religious theater. He grasped evangelical language fluently. Scripture verses came easily to him when required. Stubborn pride prevented him from yielding command of his existence to anything transcendent. Earlier that calendar year, his father had confronted him directly, declaring that a spiritual contest was underway for Franklin's very being, and that compromise represented impossible ground. The conversation haunted him as he continued traveling. One particular evening, he declined the usual socializing. Instead, he remained in the chamber and accessed the Gospel of John. Upon reaching the 3rd chapter and the discourse between Jesus and Nicodemus concerning spiritual rebirth, the concept stopped feeling remote and theoretical. He perceived that this instruction transcended something his father proclaimed to audiences. This was something he himself required internally. He extinguished his smoking habit, knelt on the carpeted floor, and whispered a brief, unadorned prayer of complete surrender. Surrender isn't weakness. It's the only real power. He would later characterize that night as marking the conclusion of years spent escaping and fighting. He came home and married Jane Austen Cunningham beneath trees on his parents' property. The external presentation transformed almost instantaneously. Around that identical period, Bob Pierce extended an invitation for a 6-week expedition across some of Asia's most damaged mission territories. Displacement encampments, places where disease consumed flesh, and young people scavenging refuse for survival left permanent impressions. Faith transmuted into something tangible for him then. It connected directly to concrete human suffering and the chance to ease burden. The hotel room decision uncovered living meaning on that journey, and his trajectory crystallized into permanent direction. The heir who rejected his inheritance, the man now proclaiming divine judgment on America, previously spent extensive years resisting the very identity that ultimately enabled him. William Franklin Graham III entered the world on July 14th of 1952 in the mountains of North Carolina, the youngest of 5 offspring created by Billy and Ruth Bell Graham. The family property near Montreat nestled in tranquil Appalachian country, though the residence itself seldom experienced quietude. Pastors, international missionaries, and influential personalities cycled through regularly as though the living area functioned as command central for a worldwide operation. Franklin later expressed that his scholastic performance, his interpersonal connections, and his behavioral choices all faced evaluation against one unstated benchmark. How would this reflect on Billy Graham's son? He despised this framework intensely. He commenced smoking cigarettes young, when his mother attempted to end the addiction through shock therapy, compelling him to consume an entire package in rapid succession. The physical effects made him profoundly nauseous. Yet the intervention failed. He recovered, retrieved another cigarette, and persisted in smoking anyway. Stubbornness branded his adolescence. He participated in physical altercations. He operated vehicles recklessly. He opposed institutional authority at every turn. He eventually faced expulsion from a preparatory academy in New York State. Reflecting back, Franklin acknowledged he had developed something resembling a prisoner of war consciousness. The famous Graham name seemed not like a gift, but like chains. Throughout it all, his mother Ruth Bell Graham refused to surrender confidence in his transformation. She administered consequences when he transgressed. She welcomed him with embraces when he stumbled. She maintained a rhythm of spiritual intercession that bordered on the miraculous. Franklin eventually recognized that any chance of walking the spiritual path his father had pioneered would first require him to walk through his mother's footprints of prayer, the countless moments she had spent kneeling and interceding for the son seemingly committed to rebellion and escape. Those formative years never fully departed from him. At 74, the identical fierce determination that previously fueled his resistance now drives his convictions. The youth who rejected the Graham name became the aging individual safeguarding it, protecting it through every conflict, every assault, and every call to moral turnaround. Whether viewed favorably or opposed vehemently, Franklin Graham's biography has never been characterized by ease. It has been a perpetual internal struggle between pushing away, bearing responsibility, and the crushing psychological burden of a name he desperately wanted to discard. What he now declares is the composite accumulation of every decision that transformed a resistive youth into the most forceful defender of a more aggressive position than his predecessor embraced. Whether that revelation generates understanding or only multiplies ambiguity remains something each individual must navigate privately. The silence he claims to abandon is the layered history of every choice, every compromise, every conviction that has defined his decades of public existence. What lens are you using to understand his journey? All power reveals character. Share your perspective in the comments section. What do you see? Like this investigation and subscribe to Crime Brief for documentaries that examine the intersection of faith, politics, and influence in American life.